is the very first part, which is being referred as Azure Desktop Architecture. So as we know that the Azure Virtual Desktop is basically nothing but a desktop and application virtualization service, and this has been running up on Azure Cloud. So Azure Virtual Desktop works. It's basically a product which is quite compatible which with all the devices, no matter what way you work on, whether you work with the Windows, whether you work with the Mac, whether you work with the iOS, whether you look with the Linux. So this structure, this section actually helps you out to understand. And this is mainly been keeping in mind basically for the people from the architect side, from the cloud architect side, from the admin side. So you can have some good understanding about the product. And yeah, here it comes up. So this lesson is going to talk about the architecture, the components, talking about the pooled and personal desktops. As we have been working on Azure, see basically on Azure itself, definitely yes, Azure has its architecture limits in terms of services, in terms of products. So the product has been designed and keeping that in mind. All right. So in such cases, say for example, if I'll just take one example of storage. All right. So, okay, what type of storages are available? What is the maximum size? What type of objects you can keep? So there are certain limits. So we are going to talk about those limits. As we are going to host the workloads onto the cloud itself, definitely the initial part is the planning. A reason you are going to deploy a workload. And that particular piece of workload needs the compute. So that means we are talking about infrastructure as a service. And at that particular point of time, the compute planning, the VM sizing. No matter whether you're working in a test environment, whether you're working in a UAT environment, whether you're working in a pre-prod, whether you're working in a prod environment, anything it can be. So the sizing, so the use case, all right. And obviously, when we are hosting a service on a cloud itself, Azure Cloud, each and every service would be related with some sort of a cost. So this section gives you some understanding from that aspect as well. So right now we are going to start with the Azure Virtual Desktop for Enterprise first of all. Now what exactly it is, all right, and what is the purpose of this one? So see, Azure Virtual Desktop, as we know that this is as good as the desktop and application virtualization service, which runs in Azure Cloud itself, isn't it? And as I mentioned earlier itself, this is quite compatible with most of the devices, whether you work with Windows, whether you work with Mac, whether you work with Android, whether you work with Linux, whether you work with iOS, anything. So ideally itself, you can also use the most up-to-date modern browsers to access your virtual desktop hosted experiences, isn't it? So this particular module, this section is actually being structured it out to help you to understand from those areas. So that is one thing. Probably keeping in mind itself. See, there are so many different use cases. Whether you talk about employees, whether you talk about specialized workloads, whether it can be related to the designing, engineering, anything it can be, right? So from every aspect, whether it is test, whether it is production, anything it can be, all right. So from all those aspects, it becomes easy for us to execute them. Now, here itself, the most important part basically which becomes is the initial planning. It's not basically how exactly it is being done. It is basically the each and every element, how you can plan. So in that case, the very first thing which comes up is the decision making, isn't it? Why? Because until and unless we know the key requirement of those departments, whether I'm working with a support team, whether I'm a development team, whether I'm a part of management team, whether I'm a part of network team, whether I'm a part of security team, or whether I'm part of the architect designing team, anything it can be. So keeping those things in mind from the business aspects, we have to understand the key requirement that which operating system, which applications do they need. Gone are those days when people they used to sit up on the physical systems. Maybe there are some organizations that are still using into that tradition itself, but now what's happening? Everything is all virtualized. Whether you talk about apps, whether you talk about operating system, whether you talk about devices, anything it can be. So virtual desktop is basically the one which gives you a collaborative product, keeping in mind with all of these solutions as well. Now, as you can see that, which is the architecture which is in front of you here right now. So in this one, there are many elements which are being coming up from Azure. Which components like Azure Active Directory, which talks about identities, which talks about authentication, which talks about authorization. And if you see the diagram, if you see the reference architecture, the Azure Active Directory is something, the one which also helps you to get connected to the on-prem. That means you can go and set up the hybrid. This gives you the flexibility that the corporate users can be synchronized to the cloud. And then after, they can be given an access to these services. Obviously, yes, when it comes down to the hybrid, there is again amount of a planning. Reason, authentication, authorization. Why? Because when it comes down to the identity hybrid itself, there are various different types of authentication methods which are being used, like password hash synchronization, you have got federation service, you've got a pass-through authentication. So all these things are there basically. So we will be discussing them for those areas as well when it comes down to the planning of identities as well. All right. As we have been working on on-prem, and as you can see, there are certain endpoints which are there on on-prem itself also. So a network connectivity from Azure towards the on-prem, or from on-prem towards the Azure as well. So in that case, we are going to leverage most of the Azure services, whether it comes in terms of networking, whether it comes up in terms of management of the workloads, whether it comes from the in terms of storage, anything it can be. So when it comes down to the Azure, Azure provides you a platform. That particular platform itself, the one which helps you to design, execute, and structure out your workload. And that particular boundary is nothing but your subscriptions. So that subscription is basically a boundary for any given customer. It's not that the customer is not going to have more than one subscription. No, they can have. Maybe, let's say, for example, if I'm working on different uh, environments, different departments, different branches, in those cases, an organization can have more than one subscription as well also. All right. So as you can see that in this structure, they're using one example of a one subscription, but having different networks. Maybe a network can be for the prod environment, a test environment, anything it can be. And along with that one, this network has got a hybrid connectivity with the on-prem. When it comes down to the hybrid connectivity, it again depends whether we are going to use a point to site or whether we have got a site to site, although there are multiple choices. But when it comes down to these services where itself we are supposed to have a good amount of a bandwidth with a low latency. In that case, the recommendation, the preferred, the best practice is all about express route. Express route is something, the one which gives you a dedicated connectivity, faster access, low latency. No doubt, the cost factor is there, agreed. But technically, when it comes down to the overall business perspective itself, at that particular piece of time, these things are clearly being considered. Whether it comes down to the latency, we don't need any latency. We need a dedicated connection on a level of high security itself. And one more thing which you can see on your screen itself, which is a network is having different subnets. Why? Why? Because the segregation of the workloads. Maybe you're having your Active Directory in one subnet, your firewalls, your virtual appliance in one subnet. The reason of segregating these workloads and different workloads in different subnets would be there are different decision factors. Like obviously you're isolating them, isn't it? You're isolating them. Isolation for what? Management. Isolation for what? Security, policies, rules, firewall settings, so that at least you can define which workload can communicate to which other workload which are in different subnets. So this section is actually uh, being talking about this one. So when it comes down to the virtual desktop, in this case, there are few services which are being taken care of by Microsoft. And there are certain responsibilities which are being taken care of by the customer as well also. So moving ahead with the next section, which talks about the Azure Virtual Desktop components. Now, which components I'm talking about? Obviously, as I said that there are few services, there are few components which are being managed by Azure. Which are those components? Likewise, you've got a gateway, you've got a remote desktop, web access service, license service, storage. Now, what are they used for? Simple. Like if in case if I'm talking about the web access, this is a kind of a service which lets the users access the virtual desktops and remote access and apps through the HTML5 compatible browser. And the good thing is that you can access them from anywhere, from any device. Why? And it can seem that, okay, you're working on a local PC. Along with that one itself, from the security perspective, you can go and integrate with a multi-factor authentication as well. And that too can be configured easily from the Azure Active Directory itself. All right. Now, the next component which you can see here, which is gateway. Gateway is basically the one which is acting as a mediator, which connects your users. Which users? The remote users to the apps and their desktops from their location, which are being well connected over the internet. So this is acting as a connection broker. All right. So connection broker is basically the one which manages the user's connection. All right. And along with that one itself, obviously we have got some diagnostic services, remote desktop diagnostics, which are really helpful in terms of identifying whether the session is success or failure. And why it is helpful? Yes, it is helpful. Why? Because the administrators can query. They can set up multiple queries for that one itself also. All right. Not only from that aspect, these are also quite helpful to be used when it comes down to the automation. Why? Why? Because you got a support of these products. So this was the product which is quite compatible and it is being taken care of by Azure. Now, is it the only component? No. There are few other components which are being taken care of by the customer. Now, what does the customer takes care of? As we are structuring up, as we are planning, as we are configuring the services onto the cloud, obviously the Azure Active Directory planning and setting up the Azure Virtual Network, connectivity, planning for the IP addressing, subnetting, supernetting. Obviously, yes. Why? Because see, in these cases, there are different teams which are being involved. So setting up the networks, that is also one of the key areas, the one which you can see. Why? Because we have to figure it out what connectivity methods, what different networks. So again, the same situation comes up whether we are going to set up for the test environment or pre-prod or dev or prod environment, anything it can be. And as we have been talking about Azure Active Directory plays a very key role here itself. Reason, that is a service, the one which is responsible or which is being considered as identity as a service. And this Azure Active Directory comes under PaaS, platform as a service. So you don't need to go and maintain any kind of infrastructure. Yes, the designing and the planning for authentication, authorization, setting up the identities is all to be taken care of by the customer. Why? Because in Azure Active Directory, you can have three different types of users, whether it can be a cloud, whether it can be a guest, whether it can be your a hybrid. Hybrid is the one which comes from the on-prem. When I'm talking about on-prem, is basically I'm talking about the full-fledged traditional Active Directory, what we have been using on our on-prem itself, right? So hybrid. If you see the other component, which is Active Directory Domain Service, so Azure Virtual Desktop, the VMs, they have to be joined to the AD and must be synced to the Azure AD itself also. And see, this is again to be taken care of by the customer. Other than that, setting up the pools, the host pool, I mean to say, for the virtual desktop, that initial planning has to be taken care of by the customer. So when we talk about pools, when we talk about the desktops, what exactly it is. So in a clear, in a very simple definition, if you see these uh, pools, pool desktops or personals, these are all following under the host pools, right? So what exactly the host pool is? Host pool is nothing but a simple collection of what? VMs. How many? One or more than one. Within where? Within my virtual desktop setup and environment itself. So here. So host pools are basically nothing but a collection of one or more than one identical. When it says identical, identical in terms of what? Identical, maybe identical in terms of compute, identical in terms of services, identical in terms of applications. So Azure Virtual Desktop is actually giving you all those such solutions, but how to set up the pool, how to configure the pool, how to manage the pool itself, this is all going to be taken care of by the customer. So here itself, if you look up, there's this reference, all right. So you have personal desktops, you have pool desktops, even, right? And the users are also having the flexibility. They can modify their desktop experience. Reason, maybe I might be having some own preferences, saving the files, shortcuts, everything it can be. So personal desktop solutions, right? Which are also being referred as persistent. Now, this persistent is basically the one which helps you out to make sure that the users are always connected to the same specific session host. Yeah, so there are certain situations in which this can be done. Now, when it comes down to the host pool is basically, as I said, that it's nothing but the one which contains the app groups. So maybe, maybe let's say, for example, I've just created up a host pool for one of my departments. Let's say, for example, there is a development team, and the development team, they're looking for certain specific OS, some development tools, some development applications, some integrations, services. So in keeping that in mind from the business perspective itself, obviously you can set up the host pool so that you can have those many number of devices. You can have your required applications and you can set them up itself also. At least, at least we know that that can fulfill what exactly they are looking out for. So it can be for different departments like HR, finance, creative, or security, management, administration, or maybe there is a compliance team, there is a security team, there is an infrastructure team, there is a support team, anything it can be. So keeping all those business needs in mind, it becomes easy for us. Why? Because the most important part is basically to understand that what exactly they need, and if we are able to fulfill, nothing is better than that, isn't it? So guys, see this how beneficial, and definitely yes, it reduces a good amount of administrative overhead. Imagine a situation, and if I take you back to the decades back, where the IT people, the admin people, they had to set up everything onto the physical devices. Too many challenges, isn't it? Too much of administrative overhead. Every day, somehow engaged with some of the other activities. Sometimes the apps are not working. Okay, apps are being repaired, reinstalled. Maybe from the organization's standards, systems are not meeting the requirement. Okay, the admin is busy, involved to update them time to time. So see, the concern is basically to highlight that okay, we can reduce those all those administrative overheads. It's not that you don't have the tasks to configure. Yes, the tasks have to be set it up. The services have to be configured. Why? Because this particular section, it does requires a very good of planning and to have each and every understanding as well, isn't it? So from that perspective, this is going to be very, very helpful. No doubt, each and every element has to be planned and structured. Okay. So now you can imagine, like say, okay, how much decision has to be taken. So in this case, the architects planning, decision making, not only from their aspect, why? Because you're involving Azure as well. So that means Azure architect, Azure designing comes into the picture. So yeah, this in this case, the idea was to just give you some understanding about host pools. So you can have different host pools. Maybe let's say, for example, I'll give you one more example here. Say there are some users from the frontline workers, right? So frontline workers are there. They might need their own setup. They might need their own set of applications, isn't it? So are you going to combine them into the same host pool? No, not at all. So keeping that in mind from the business need perspective, this is going to be a very, very important planning itself, isn't it? As we have been hosting the services on Azure, so each and every service, I'm not talking about the virtual desktop only, it can be any kind of a service, all right? It can be any kind of a service, whether it is network, whether it is storage, whether it is directory service, whether it is your database, whether it is your compute, anything it can be. So when we talk about limitations, we can say that these are some architecture limits, all right? So there has to be some configuration and the process which has to be taken care of, all right? Here. So as you can see that these are some of the services for which they have clearly mentioned up. But yes, if you just look up for Azure service limits, right away you come up with the options of all those components which showcases you the architecture service limits of those products. Whether I'm talking about Azure AD, whether you're talking about the storage, whether you're talking about databases, anything it can be. Similarly, if you focus mostly, if we talk about the virtual desktop limitations, see, yeah, these are some of the current ones. Okay, how many tenants you can have, how many workspace you can set up, how many households, application groups, how many you can have basically. Or when it comes down to the delegation, to how many people you can delegate and how many session hosts you can have in each and every pool itself also, right? So session host servers are there and role assignments delegation is there itself. So the idea is basically just to highlight that keeping in mind when it comes down to the initial planning, when it comes down to the initial designing itself, this is really helpful, guys. Why? Because if in case if we are not aware of that one, it becomes really a bit difficult for us to figure it out as well also. All right. So in these cases, it's always being recommended that you should be well up to date with all those service limits in Azure itself. All right, guys. Now, as I had mentioned that, see any kind of a workload. So here itself, I'd like to give you some example. Say for instance, if I want to go and deploy a database server, I want to go and deploy a web server, I want to go and deploy an application server. So in that context, are you going to deploy any kind of a VM? No. Any size of the VM? No. Why? Why? Because each and every product has its own benchmark. Each and every product has some best practices. Each and every workload, any kind of a workload, they've got some minimum set of requirements which should be fulfilled. Similarly, so the use case comes up. It can be any kind of a use case, as I said that. Whether you're looking for a small environment test, dev, anything it can be. Other than that itself, you can imagine, okay, you can go with a storage optimized, memory optimized, compute optimized. You're looking for a gaming applications. You're looking for ERP based applications. You're looking for a high end database applications. So what are those? Am I going to use only one side of a compute? No, not at all, please. In that case, obviously, the good thing would be to identify which workload and what are the benchmark requirements of that particular workload as well. So if we are quite aware of that particular workload, well, fair enough. And most of the products, and most of the vendors, they do provide us the configuration which are being recommended for that particular product. If in case by any chance, if there are certain kind of a products for which such benchmarks are not being provided, in that case, yes, we can see, we can go and deploy, set up with a specific configuration, and then after you can, based on to your bottleneck checks, performance checks, either you can increase, either you can reduce. So VM sizing is basically the one which helps you to, which gives you actually some guidelines and keeping in mind that okay, how many CPUs or which particular size. So Microsoft gives you a flexibility to pick and choose from the series and from the size as well. So these series and these sizes are nothing but the different use cases for different workloads. Whether you're looking for a burstable, whether you're looking for a general purpose or a GPU accelerated, memory optimized, storage optimized, memory optimized itself. It can be anything of a gaming application, which I mentioned earlier. So today, if in case if I go with one particular size, maybe over the period of time, you realize that, okay, hey, the workload which was being configured with a specific particular size is not optimized. Maybe the workload is not responding. maybe there is a latency, maybe there is some application latency, or maybe the loading of application is a bit slow, or the performance of application is a bit slow. In that case, what I'm going to do, you're going to work with the scaling functionality. What is this scaling? Scaling means you can go with the vertical scaling, you can go with the horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling in the sense you can go with the scale up, scale down. So you can increase the size, reduce the size of the VM. So if you have got that particular flexibility, then at least if the workload what we have planned and deployed, it is possible that the vertical scaling or horizontal scaling can also be done. When it comes down to the horizontal, that means that we are talking about scale in and scale out. All right. So that means at any given moment of time, the instances can be increased, instances can be reduced, keeping in mind from the load impact, keeping in mind from the schedule perspective, keeping in mind from the metric perspective. So at times, the sizing, it really does matters. Maybe let's say, for example, if I'm working on a test environment, so in that situation, I might not go with a high configuration compute. So what was that case? That case was a simple example of a test environment. So from all those aspects, every key factor is to be taken care of, isn't it? So this is not about implementation, guys. This is all about a bit of planning and bit of designing as well. Also, right? Okay, yeah. And yes, one of the other key factors, which also has a very significant place in the planning and designing, pricing. Let's not forget that. Now, when it comes down to the pricing, guys, it's basically again to the customers that what sort of an agreement they're having with Microsoft. Let's say, for example, there are different types of subscriptions. You have got a pay as you go, you've got a trial, you have a developers edition, you have got an enterprise agreement. So from that aspect, the pricing, it does matters. Now, one good thing which you can take the benefit of is Azure Hybrid. Why? Why? Because that gives you the flexibility to use your own existing Windows licenses, bring your own license. So Azure Hybrid benefits is something, the one which, if in place, if integrated, if configured, you can bring down the cost. Is that the only procedure? Is that the only way? Is that the only possibility? No. There are different other possible ways in which you can bring down the cost. As I mentioned that hybrid benefit is one of them. Other than that itself, you can also opt for the Windows 10 multi-sessions as well. So in that case, how this is beneficial? In that case, we can let more users to log in to one instance, to one single VM, rather than you're having multiple VMs, isn't it? So Windows 10 has got that capability itself in which you can take the benefit of that as well. So obviously in this case, see, if in case if I'm part of the cost optimization team, isn't it? So what is my responsibility? My responsibility is basically to ensure that how we can bring down the cost. Maybe let's say, for example, if I'm running with a test environment and we figure it out, hey, that test environment has been running for more than a long period of time unexpectedly, and it's hardly being used. What are you going to result into? Cost. On the other side, if I take you one more example, let's say I've got a database server. and that database server is being used for the dev environment. But for some given reason itself, you have been you did configure that database server with a high compute setup. Although that particular server is not being used that much, but yes, it is being kept up and running. Again, from the optimization team, they figured it out. Okay, hey, this is a particular compute which is generating a huge cost at that particular period of time. The reachability, the accountability, the responsibility becomes for the relevant team members projects. So the idea behind is basically, if in case if we are deploying something, the kind of the workload, the type of the setup, the workload compute should be well justified. So the point is basically how you can bring down the cost pricing, isn't it? And the other factor, the one which you can see, is basically Azure hybrid benefit. This is the something which is really benefit for Windows servers, which can save a huge cost. Why? How it can save the cost? It can save the cost by saying that you can use your existing bring your own license. So maybe let's say, for example, if the customers are already having some pre-existed licenses for a long period of time with a long agreement, then this is going to help them to reduce the cost. The third factor which helps them to bring down the cost, which is nothing but the Azure reserved instances. Now, what are these reserved instances? Maybe let's say, for example, I want to have a specific set of a compute which I need for a long period of time. Or maybe let's say for a 1 year agreement, 2 years agreement, 3 years agreement with the same compute itself. Then in that case, you can prepay for your VM usage and save the money. So these things can be used into the combination. As you can see that, okay, the Azure reserved instances, if combined with the Azure hybrid, it can bring up to your 80% savings over the list prices. And also from the host load balancing. Now see, this session host load balancing is something which is specifically a particular feature for the Azure Virtual Desktop, which helps you to maintain and to balance the cost. How? Depending on the session host servers. How many servers do you need up and running available at that particular moment of time, depending on the maximum number of users. Maybe you want all the users to be connected to one server, and then after once it reaches to the maximum number of limit, it can move down to the next host. And that host is basically being referred as a session host. So these things, the idea is basically that